Kirk, welcome back to Easy Conversations. Always a pleasure to chat with you. We do chat quite a bit behind the scenes or offline too. And then another important distinction there. This is your third time on the show, and you're the only guest to have done that. Thank you for coming on and doing this with me.
Absolutely honored. No, happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Furk. Ah,
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just jump right into it. What's going on in your life right now? What's new? What are the challenges you're dealing with?
yeah, I've been at my current position here for just over a year now. So things are going well work-wise. Boys, my oldest is turning 13, so becoming a teenager. My youngest is 11, so he's making his way through elementary school there. We've had a lot of success over the last little while with him. And although today I am running around with the kids because my wife's traveling for work, so there's a little bit of that. But yeah, different challenges that are going on. I would just say, just trying to manage the expectations of my own thought process of where I need to be and what I need to be doing as a husband, as a father, as an employee, or just a general individual in society. Because I think things are extreme right now.
Mm, yeah, yeah, no, for sure. So, what, at least based on your perception, what seems extreme?
I think we've lost the ability to sit down in regular society and have a conversation or a debate on general moral standings of what we see is appropriate for anything from a day at school for the kids or what can be said to a colleague at work. I think we're all looking for something in the middle, but the guidelines are pushing us to either extremes of you have to be this or you have to be that. And if you're not this, you're obviously that. And it's difficult to then create this sense of neutrality or a middle ground when having conversations, even with my kids, to try to help push that sense of being centered.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with you. I think people then tend to be operating in fear because they feel like anything they say can be taken out of context, or we're not allowed to make mistakes. We're not allowed to change our opinions about things, right?
Yeah.
Like, snapshot in time today, I may have an opinion about something and I get new information and I may want to change my opinion, but that creates further consequences of even coming out and being vulnerable enough to say, you know what, I've incorporated different ideas and I would like to change my opinion, but then you get chastised for that because you're like, no, last week you said this. So how
Yeah.
dare you say this now? And I think that prevents growth. As much as I like to think some of the intention behind a lot of these things are meant to be good, but it actually forces things in an opposite direction. That's been my view on things.
I absolutely agree. We don't celebrate growth because of that. Like you said, I think we're diminishing the fact that we are willing to accept that people can grow. And that's where I think communication like this is ideal because we sit down and we challenge the narrative and the conversation. And then through that, our opinions and our perspectives grow and our ability to share that shows that growth. Where if we are held to a view we've had in the past due to limited knowledge or our perspective at that time, we are shunned for that growth. I think that's a terrible position to be in.
But I think part of it also, then you see a lot of people dig their heels, right? Where they're not willing to change their stance, or there's not a lot of openness around listening to other people's ideas. Or where I think a lot of the growth also happens is by being open to hear what other people have to share, and then feeling confident in yourself that you can still hold your beliefs and listen to other people, or be confident that maybe you might learn a thing or two. You don't have all the answers. Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest thing. We go into a conversation with the hope to argue our position when really we should be going in to understand someone else's position. Like, I think it was, I mentioned this a little while ago. I had a very different opinion about an individual on how they conducted their uh,
Yeah.
daily lives and everything else. And through mutual friends, someone reached out and was like, "Hey, have you seen this person in a while? I think they've had a lot of growth." And I think immediately my first reaction was, whatever. Because I thought very negatively on how they were conducting themselves in a number of ways. And I sat back and I said, I talk about this all the time. I have conversations. I encourage people to be proactive within their listening and to give people chances to grow. So I sat down with myself and I said, okay, put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
And I invited this individual out for a coffee and I went with a fresh mind to say, okay, I know what the past was and I will sit down and have a conversation about where they are right now, what their future aspirations are. And in some ways, I saw a lot of growth. I think there was still a tremendous amount of growth that they needed to still go through. But it helped me sit back and say, okay, I celebrated their growth. I even had that conversation with them to say, hey, from my point of view, I know we didn't always get along in the past, but seeing you take these chances and be vulnerable this way and move yourself forward, I think you're going in a great direction.
Mhm.
And to encourage that as well, to say
Mhm.
that we were obviously butting heads at one time, and I'm willing to come to the table because I see you're coming to the table. And I think we need to do that more. And it's not like I've had multiple conversations with this person afterwards, but I could see that their path has continued because outside themselves, people are starting to see that work and they're
Mhm.
celebrating that internally as well now.
Yeah, yeah, and I loved that aspect because I remember us having this conversation a few weeks ago, and yeah, that hit me too because I was very similar to yourself of that position, man. Hard to see the growth, but it's we're all going at it at our own pace. And I think
Mhm.
what I took from that conversation is I put myself in a position where there was a time where people may have looked at me, not that it matters, but I wasn't growing either. I felt like I had to hold myself accountable in terms of talk a big game, but is it actually showing up in reality? And the concept that I was able to relate to is even in the therapy space that I work in now, we often have to remind ourselves to meet our clients where they're at
Mhm.
and not judge them and not feel discouraged that they're not showing growth or whatever, because everyone's going at it in their own way and at their own pace. And how can you be someone that can be supportive at times, right? And facilitate
Yeah.
that growth for them. So, yeah, I think that talking to you about that brought up a lot for myself too, and reflect that who am I to judge, right? And everyone is on their own individual journey and learning at a different pace, a different time. And there's really no time limit when it comes to that kind of stuff, right? And
Yeah, yeah, and that actually that's a great statement because I recently just had my parents here. They were here for my mom's birthday and everything else, and my dad's been going through a lot of different struggles in regards to alcoholism and a lot of fear internally about he doesn't necessarily have a purpose, in my
mm,
opinion, anymore. And we had it out where at one point 2 to 3 years ago, it was I had created some boundaries where my kids wouldn't be with him in certain situations unless he was sober. And he brushed that off until my mom gave him some ultimatums at the same time. And I think for him, he had to reevaluate what he valued. And this time, when they came back to town here and they were staying with my brother, my dad came over and I wanted to see, unfortunately for myself, I wanted to see that he was still within that old routine, which would
mm,
justify my anger in some ways that I pushed you away. I'm not ready for you to come back in my life, which were my own issues. So when he came in and he was actually making progress, I suffered with that in some ways because I wasn't ready for him to have progress.
mm,
And it was only until my wife was like, I struggle so much with your dad after all we've gone through with him and everything else. And I heard it from someone else. And then it was funny because I was like, I was ashamed of having those feelings. So we had a conversation right there, which was like, okay, like from, I had to put myself back into his shoes to be like, where he was to what he's doing right now, the vulnerability of what he was going through. And unfortunately, he still refuses to sit down with a therapist or someone who could really help him push through this. But he's got some friends, he's got a few other things, and it's slow, but there is progress. So I had to just having that conversation with my wife to be like, hey, he has had progress here, he has had progress here, and he's had progress here. It may not be what we would love to see in the amount of progress within the timeline, but like you said, he could have gone the other way. And I need to be grateful for his ability to find any progress at this point, in the sense that my kids have had conversations with him. He's lucid with those conversations. He has provided them with a grandfather figure where he wasn't doing that before. Not that it's not been maybe the best, it's an improvement. I think when I talk to my kids, we're fairly straightforward with them in those conversations too, to be like, grandfather's having issues in regards to just with himself, and like, what do you recommend when you have conversations with him to make him feel comfortable, in the sense that we're all vulnerable. And I think they look at him in a different perspective all too, perspective in the sense that they are they're not just children, they are part of our family where they have a role to play with empathy and compassion and acceptance at the same time, and knowing that we're all vulnerable. And for myself to be vulnerable and have those conversations with them at the start, I was concerned, like, how would they view him? But I think for the most part, they've been more welcoming because they understand that he's been struggling rather than grandpa's just being an asshole.
Right. Yeah.
So that was an interesting change of perspective over the last little while as well, convincing myself that it's okay for other people, like you said, to go through this transition in their own timeline. While I need to explore that, I also need to just confirm my own boundaries and my
Mhm.
perspectives on where they sit within that. But it's been good. It's been challenging to my own personal views, which I think is important.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you was because last year we talked about some of the challenges you and I have both encountered at being fathers, our own sons, and how that has presented itself in different ways. And then this time I wanted to talk about how we've taken those lessons and applied them to our own dads because it's interesting. And I'll preface this because I had a client recently share with me that he's he's younger, but he's really struggling because his dad is struggling. He's like, I grew up looking at my dad as like this Superman figure, right? And then I realized he wasn't. And he's really contending with that. And I think that just shows like just the youth aspect of it. But something that happens as we mature that we realize that, yeah, while growing up, we look at our dads as this figure of being a superhero, they're still human. They're still going to experience. And one of the things I've learned, and I want to get your thoughts, becoming a father, because it's so challenging at times, and obviously you're figuring it out on the go. If you're able to find that within you, you can still have compassion for your own dad. And I appreciate you sharing some of the challenges he's going through because that can be hard for any one individual themselves to experience. And I've wrestled with a few things over the past year with my dad's illness and health choices. And it's been, it's just been a polarity in terms of at some point I experienced resentment, at some point I experienced compassion and empathy. And I see what he needs to do. And it's going back to that conversation around growth. And part of my frustration is sometimes he's not choosing that for himself. That's where it's okay. Where can I meet him, and where is he? So, how's that experience been for you to turn things around and look at your own dad and be like, okay, at some point now, I feel like it's interesting how it goes, right? We have to almost parent our own parents at times.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing. I think at that point where my dad was obviously struggling with alcohol, and it became a problem where that was his main concern on a daily basis, was how do I get another drink in me to numb what I'm feeling. For me, that I was able to ignore that up to a point and still see him as this, even for myself, as this heroic individual that I guess it is youth in some ways. Like we feel like we're invincible. And I thought my dad was invincible in a lot of ways. He could bounce back from this. This is just, he's my dad. He gave me all of this in regards to my ability to see things with empathy and compassion and reason things out with logic and to always listen first and ask questions later. That was all my dad. So when I see him being so shut off and rigid within himself and the shame and everything else that was oozing from him, it wasn't until it became an issue with things I valued more than my friendship with my dad. So my relationship with my wife and my kids. It wasn't until that was in jeopardy that I was like, okay, hold on. Like, I need to look at this in a whole different situation. And at that point, I think it became obvious that my dad, in some ways, will forever be my dad, but at the same
Mhm.
time, he is very human and he is his own person, and he's not what I perceived him to be, nor should he have been. It was a disservice to him and myself to envision him as this heroic individual who could not do wrong. Because and for myself, it was a learning where I didn't give him the compassion to go through what he was grieving with or what he had found loss with. And by the time this year has gone by and some other times I had worked through a bit of my anger and my resentment that he was not this individual that as soon as you meet your heroes, I was able to sit back and be like, okay, as a human being, as someone who I do care about and who can benefit from my compassion rather than my resentment or my anger of what I was hoping he would eventually be, I was able to have more of a conversation with him as a friend, not necessarily as a kid or as an acquaintance or someone who was holding him to something, but as a friend to be like, hey, okay, you messed up real
Yeah.
bad. And I held you to something that I held in my own perception of you. And I apologize for that as well, because there was no need for me to do that to you in a vulnerable time of your life. And I think by doing that, I've given him space to grow, but I've also given myself space to accept his growth in that way too. Because at the same time, when I was resenting and everything else, I saw him is just a human and a person. And with anybody, I truly believe we all make decisions and we have to live by those consequences. And those consequences are ours to own. So at that point, if he was to continue down these roads, I was at a point where I accepted that, where I was like, okay, if you end up drinking yourself to death or you end up getting divorced from my mother, those were decisions you made. And I'm okay with that because those are your decisions. That's not the decision of the hero I grew up with or the hero I imagined. Those are the decisions of a man who had all of these experiences within his own life that brought him to this position, and that's okay.
Mm.
And at that point, I could then say to him, let me, I can now own some of that, if that makes sense. I'm
Yeah.
at a position where I can own it without the resentment of who I thought he was, but who he is at that moment, where it wasn't as heavy anymore. It was just a good friend of mine who is hurting, and I can hold space for him. I can hold time for him. I can hold that without resentment or anger to what I thought he was. And I think at that point we were able to have reasonable conversations and reasonable expectations of each other's actions. I don't think he's necessarily there with me in the sense because he's still living in so much shame of who he was always trying to be for us as his kids. But that's just part of how I look at it as well. I'm like, that's okay. Because I think that's what really fills him with shame. So I won't hold him to that either. And yeah, so I think for myself, it was just taking that step back and being like, okay, if this was, I would do this for anybody I just met off the street for the most part. So why wouldn't I do it for my own dad?
Yeah.
Only because I had these perceived expectations of it? No, shame on me. So I sat back and I was like, okay, let all that go, release myself of that, give myself the acceptance to be like, he's just a human who needs an ear. He needs me to listen. And where I can offer him something and he's in a position to hear it, give it to him. Otherwise, be there for him when he needs it, but don't hold him to anything he can't hold himself to at this time either. If that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What I'm hearing is just the expectation piece, right? We take expectations on other people, especially people that are close to us, or family members or loved ones. And that can be tough knowing that there's that pressure on you. What I'm hearing from you is the acceptance takes that pressure off, not only for him, but even for you, where you just accept things as they come, accept the individual for where they are in that given aspect of their life. And then you're no longer holding them to this. I think a lot of times we do put people on a pedestal, right? Because we know who they were, or we see some sort of potential in them, or we feel like we see how things should be
Mhm.
happening for them, right? And when they're not choosing that for themselves, that's where we tend to get frustrated and angry with them. And part of it, I think, what I've come to realize is that judgment is really because it's something we see in ourselves too at times, right?
Yes.
And I've really tried to tune into that as hard as it can be in the moment, that if I'm being angered by someone else's choice, I'm not judging them, I'm judging myself because I can see that in myself. Because if I'm truly sitting with compassion and acceptance, then it doesn't matter what they're doing at the end of the day. I can choose to participate in the relationship. I can choose to remove myself. But if I'm going to participate, I just have to accept it for what it is. And I think that's where a lot of people get hung up.
Yeah, yeah, and I think once you end up doing that as well, like when I start to consider, my wife and I were having a discussion at the dinner table after they had left one dinner, and it was interesting. She said to me, I was so angry with how your dad was talking about the dinner, and I just looked at her and I was like, why? And she's like, how he would do that to you, and it was interesting because I was like, was I angry? And she's no, and I was like, so why are you angry? She's because I care about you and I don't like that he did that to you. And I was like, yeah, okay, but am I angry? And she said, no. I said, I've already forgiven him for that. So for you to hold that anger as well seems to defeat the purpose of what I've gone to actually let that go.
Mm.
And it was interesting because she was like, yeah, okay. And it almost created a lot more light with even within the family when they came over. There was less expectations from us all
Mm.
because they were holding that space for me because they thought that's what I wanted as well. And it was interesting because we care about all those the individuals within our family, my brother, my sister, the whole kind of thing. And when I was just like, nah, it's I've dealt with it and I've come to terms with it and I'm okay with it. It was a very interesting thing because we just sat at the table then and almost just you could see a lot of the pressure leave her as well to be like, okay, this is good. And it made the dinners easier. It made the conversations easier. She was able to let go a lot of things because she was, she's a mama bear. She's protecting her family at the same time. And I didn't recognize that I had to have that conversation either. But it was one of those things where I was like, ah, of course I did. And
Mhm.
these people care about my well being. They know how much it was held up in me. And for it to come back in again and again, put salt in the wound or whatever it was. And then for me to be like, no, the space was there. It was, I didn't realize maybe if I had that much influence or my thoughts had that much influence in the past. But it was good for me to have those conversations and see that sharing that and expressing that to those around me definitely lightened the emotion of those situations at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing you're touching on, and I tend not to like using these terms because it can come across as rigid, but the dichotomy of the masculine and the feminine, right? Like
Mm.
the feminine coming in very emotional based, like thinking with the emotion. And then how do you, as the masculine, be like putting more of that rational sense and the linear
Yeah.
thinking around it that I can appreciate the emotion here, but I've thought this through and this is the sequence I've thought it through. And the beauty of it is, how do you balance that out? And in a healthy
Yeah.
relationship, both people can hold space for each other and not take it personally, right? Because if
Yes.
you were not grounded in yourself, you could have taken it personally or gotten upset about how she was reacting to your dad reacting to you. But that's
Yeah.
where the beauty of the relationship comes in, is you can hold space for each other and talk it through and see that, okay, there's some harmony here, and how do we bring that balance, right? And then I think that's the beauty of marriage in that sense, where
Yeah.
I find that in my marriage too, there's often conversations that come up, and I've had to work on understanding, okay, where is this person coming from? What's their motivation? What's triggering them? And how do I just, sometimes it's just sitting there and listening. And once it's all
Mhm.
out, then you can be like, okay, this is what I'm hearing now.
100%. And I think that's where we need to look at marriages and relationships as and how they were a complement to each other rather than a necessary need for each other. I hope that comes
Yeah.
up the right way. Where her emotions were complementing my logic
Yes.
in most situations to be like, isn't this a wonderful thing? Don't forget about how beautiful this is emotionally at the same time, which is a necessary thing for me to see a lot of the color of life.
Yes.
And I think for her at the same time, like we just had some interesting conversations about our work and everything else, and there was a lot of emotion in it, and it was like, is this what you mean by this? Have you not succeeded here, here, and here? And you could see her be like, oh, yes, you're right. I can't believe I was thinking. I was like, no, of course I could believe you're thinking like this. Your heart's in it and everything else. And I think that's where the complement of a relationship really starts to find its strides. And when you can then have those conversations, I think, like you said, where you're both grounded and you could look at the darkest parts or the brightest parts of your relationship and have those conversations, it really starts to blossom. And that's the beauty of a well balanced and communicative marriage or relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. And then coming back to the aspect of looking at our fathers, I think maybe there's some wisdom to be shared here for maybe our youth or younger men, or even men maybe in our age group, who have a lot of resentment and anger towards their dads. And perhaps that does fracture the relationship. And sometimes it's not something you can repair directly. One of the things that I've guided people who are in similar situations is getting around the idea that forgiveness sometimes isn't for the other person. That's where people get stuck. It's like, how can you forgive so you're not carrying this resentment into your life, and you're able to heal that part, whether you're having a direct conversation with your father or indirect conversation, however you
Mhm.
do it, but it does allow you to show up differently in your life, whether you have children or not. But you see so much aggression in society at times. And I think part of it is because the repair hasn't happened in that relationship between father and son.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we have a failure of what forgiveness is. We see forgiveness as is something we provide to someone else, and I think you stated that. And I think that's a failure of what forgiveness is. I think forgiveness truly is we forgive our perceptions or how we see someone else in our own lives. Not that we let that, say, anger go or we change our true perspective on them. I think forgiveness is letting us let go of the anger or the control that someone or something has over us given a certain life experience or situation or event. So for me, forgiveness is truly a personal thing in regards to the power that something has over us. In regards to my dad, I forgave the idea of essentially what he was necessarily doing to himself, which then implied to the family. So it wasn't that I didn't have my boundaries. It wasn't that I had let go of all my anger or my regret of what he was doing or anything else. It was my ability to forgive myself or him within my perspective that he could do such a thing. And
Mm.
that was okay because he's human. And once I let go of that, like you said, I was able to see things from a different view. And not only that, I didn't hold that strong emotion so vibrantly where I wasn't able to see everything else. So I forgave that to let other things in so I could look at it rather as a lesson, as somewhere to move forward, or as something to reflect on for future events. And I think that's what forgiveness is to me. It's telling yourself and telling your body that no longer has that extreme power over you. And it can be for pleasurable things as well, like lust or whatever else. You need to forgive yourself for having a moment of weakness in any situation of weakness of anger, weakness of all of that, and be like, okay, I forgive that moment. What do I need to learn from it? And the idea, I think forgiveness also gives you a chance to not fall into that trap again of those emotions of that situation or of that moment because it provides space for learning.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think so. I think we put so much pressure on everything, and everything becomes rigid and tight. And there's one of the things I've learned just with yoga and jujitsu is just being loose, right? Letting things flow. And I think that's it's a weird analogy, but that's what forgiveness allows is like you're no longer rigid and tight. You're just letting things flow because you're no longer holding people to these standards or expectations that have never been agreed upon. They've
Hmm.
never been talked about. And I think it goes both ways, right? Like our families have expectations of us as well. And it's again, you're basing it on something that you may or may not achieve. And it's you said, we're going to make mistakes. And then we beat ourselves up, unfortunately, at times for making those mistakes without recognizing that, well,
Yeah.
this is an opportunity. And maybe I need to learn this lesson multiple times before I figure it out.
And that's the key. Learn the lesson, right? It's providing because I think if we're rigid, like you're saying, which I think it's a great analogy, um, if you're rigid, you don't provide yourself that space to learn. And yeah, there's a chance you're going to make that same mistake multiple times. And really, until you find a place of flow or your ability to look at it in a different manner by not being rigid within your thought process,
Mhm.
you end up finding a path forward. And it's one of those things where I think it's interesting. I was talking to an individual and they were like, it was only until I broke was I able to move forward. And that statement, it was like, what do you mean? I hit my lowest thing. I hit rock bottom and I broke. And it was one of those things where it's like you could no longer be rigid within your thought process. Like it was like you were shattered and you were nothing but fluid at that point, which is which is goes back to what you were saying there, and I think that's an important thing. And I think for us, the older we get, we find that we can now be in situations where we don't have to hit rock bottom in order to find the ability to become malleable again, because life is life has taught us so many things because we have failed numerous amount of times. The idea that someone, I can't remember, someone with scars and everything else, it was an analogy at one point, and they said, wow, you must have had a really rough life and a hard life and everything else. Did you not learn from your mistakes? And it was one of those things where it's like, I've done nothing but learn from this. And
Mhm.
every one of these scars and every one of these imperfections is something that has provided me space to live a truly full life that those who are or unscarred or anything else have not had a chance to live at all. And so we can't forget that idea as well. Like we need to hit those marks in order to give us perspective as we grow within our lives to not have to maybe hit those highs or hit those lows in order to make progress and move forward, but to find peace within our learnings. And because I think that's the true goal is to find peace rather than
Mhm.
sorrow or love or happiness and everything else, to live a peaceful life and be open to those emotions when they are available to us and have them ebb and flow and create more events and experiences for us at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I think what's coming out for me is in Stoic philosophy, we talk about, I'm going to paraphrase here, but essentially, man is unfortunate who hasn't experienced adversity because he hasn't had the opportunity to prove to himself that he can deal with it. And we are so uncomfortable and we try to like, one of the things I've really that's really sunk in for me working in the addiction side too is this pain pleasure cycle. And we will do absolutely anything to avoid that pain, even though we're going to have to pay for it later, probably 10 times more. But that's the human condition is I don't want to experience pain.
Yeah.
And I see that in my own dad at times. And that's been what's been really tough for me to watch. So if I could just elaborate, I haven't really shared it a whole lot, but
Mhm.
he's diagnosed with lung cancer because he smoked his whole entire life since the age of 19. And that brought a lot of resentment for me because part of me wasn't surprised when we got that diagnosis. But fortunately, he got treatment and he's in remission now, but he's still stuck in this way of thinking around my health is not the same. I don't have the same energy levels. I'm susceptible to getting sick. I'm at high risk, and he's living in this fear. And I was visiting a couple of weeks ago, and I tried to talk to him about it. And the way I see it is, God's giving you another chance here, and what are you going to do with it?
Mm.
And again, in a compassionate way, I said, I don't truly know because I'm not in your shoes, the pain you're experiencing and the thoughts. I can't put myself in your
Mm.
shoes when it comes to that. But what I can see is the opportunity here. And I
Yeah.
think part of that frustration is whether or not he chooses that opportunity for himself, because that's not in my control. But that's where I think that's been part of my experience with it all is the ups and downs, the roller coaster of it all is the going back and forth between the compassion and resentment. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a great point, in the sense that I think a lot of us would look at that and say, what a gift. You've been shown how fragile life is, and then you've been given another chance to live each moment as if it could be your last, because you've seen how close you've walked to
mm,
the edge. And I think that can be very, very difficult for those in and around. So, much like yourself, my dad, I think part of him that brought him into being a bit of an alcoholic is he went through prostate cancer and everything else, and he saw
mm,
his life going down, but very similar. And when he came out, it was somewhat the same thing where I didn't quite recognize it as well as you did. He was very content to sit at home and just contemplate on everything that he wishes he had done. And now he's in this position where he's so fragile, per se. And it just threw me because I was like, yeah, you're not dead. That's the most important part here. Stop acting like you're dead,
yeah,
like, or
right.
death's around the corner. Like, for celebrate the fact that you have another meal and enjoy that meal. Go out and kiss your kids and do everything you thought you wouldn't be able to do, which has put you in this state of depression because you might not be able to do it while you're not doing it. I remember being like, "What the is wrong with you?
Yeah,
Right? Good squandering such a glorious gift."
yeah,
Uh, and I still think some of that today. And it's yeah, and I think unfortunately that strictly just becomes our own lesson, and accepting that for where we are in our lives right now. My wife's grandmother is currently in the hospital. Things aren't great, and I'm her dad is a only child, and his father's passed away, and she's the only living parent. And very similar in the sense, watching him try to deal with grief in this situation is very difficult because he's not celebrating the fact that he has, a, in my opinion, possible time left. It's celebrating the fact that everything he's going to lose, rather than celebrating what he currently still has at this moment. And it's one of those things where I made the mental note personally and having conversations to be like, try not to be that. Like, try, not saying I'll succeed at that, but remember these moments. This is a learning moment for myself. And then give him some forgiveness in those moments for not having the foresight or maybe the ability when he was my age to watch someone go through this, to say, try not to be there. And Yeah, I think when I look at my dad, maybe that way too. Yeah, once again, going back to that forgiveness side, to be like, you, unfortunately, he wasn't given that grace or the ability to learn that grace for himself. But I got to be thankful that my dad gave me the ability to find that grace within myself. So as I won't follow within that same trap he is right now. And what that's one of those distasteful lessons, but I think that it is one of the most important lessons that maybe my dad could teach me at the same time is don't squander it. I got to be grateful for the fact that as my oldest is sitting here wondering what the heck I'm talking about. Oh, dad's in some heavy stuff. Yeah, it's a gift that maybe I never wanted, but it's a gift I will treasure to the point where when I'm in that same position, I hope I remember and I can pull that gift out and be like, you've learned something from here, apply that lesson, move forward with it. You have that ability within you. Don't do the same thing. And then if my kids can take that a step further, I think that's the whole goal as parents. So in some ways, he's done his job as a parent by providing me those lessons. It's a terrible one, but it's a lesson at the same time.
Yeah, that's one of the things that comes up a lot in my conversation with other men. I think there's an aspect of generational trauma that comes into play. But what I like to not only remind myself, but some of these men I talk to is there is an aspect of unfinished business that we can choose to take on. And
Mhm.
as much as we can look at our parents and have that resentment that, oh, you're not doing enough, or you could be doing so much more if you just slightly shift your perspective or your view on things. But we can also take that responsibility and make that choice that, okay, can I take care of this unfinished business? So then I'm not passing it along. And
Yeah.
I think there's a beauty in that because it makes our relationships, especially in this context with our parents and our children, so much more meaningful. It's like this
Hmm.
chain that continues on, this idea of epigenetics, where you can basically get your genes to turn on and activate in a certain way. There's so much going on, right? Where you can make that choice. So then future generations are almost inheriting it in a way. I think there's more to it. And I think another thing to consider is people's conception of what happens after death. And trying to
Yes.
toy with that with my own dad. I'm like, okay, what are you afraid of? This is it. What are you afraid of? And I think everyone's understanding is different, and which brings about a lot of fear. But maybe to conclude, let's maybe jump into that. What happens?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I think that's one of the most beautiful things. That's an incredible statement. And I love it. The idea that when we look at our lives, they are short. They're short. They're
Yes.
short. Don't That's a wonderful statement. Why are we trying to be perfect within this short life? Our ability to provide the next generation the lessons, that's what we can't forget that idea. We're not supposed to have all the answers by the time we're done. That's the human experience, the ability to fail and learn. It's the human experience, giving those before us the chance to run the course of their lives and pass that torch to us, where we will
Mhm.
run that course of our lives and to continue to move societal thought forward or morality forward or value chains forward. And I think exactly as you said, the ability to let that go then comes into your faith and whatever that may be. If it is the idea that this isn't over and we're able to be with each other once again, I think that in some ways can make it easier. I think in some ways too, that can make it maybe slightly harder in the sense that for some, it might diminish the drive to really push for as much as they can get out of this life. But I think that once again comes down to your purpose in life and what you're hoping to achieve out of life, in the sense that why are we here? And I think there's a moral obligation for us all to try to better the lives of those of us in and around us to move things forward that way, regardless of your faith. And then from there, it is to experience, to have this human experience and to experience as much as you possibly can. And that includes the good and the bad. And I think what I love about that statement is as we It's so funny. People talk about on your deathbed, what are your regrets and everything else. And I think no matter who you are, in some way you'll have some regrets. And maybe that's the script that creates our next evolvement into who we become or where we end up, or if you're in nirvana or wherever you end up being at that time, that might be the final lesson to say, okay, you took 80 years to do this. You took 102 years to do this. You took 13 years to do this, or 45. From there, this is your outcome. And what do you want to do with that? Like to me, that'd be absolutely beautiful if that's where we ended up being. Like, how cool would that be at the same time? It's okay. Here's our next episode button. Boop. Where do we take it from there? Yeah, yeah. I love that statement. Yeah, yeah. Great perspective.
Well, and I think also holding space for those crucial moments that, again, we're specifically talking about our dads, where they intervened at some point that we can remember and recognize that, hey, if my dad hadn't stepped in at this point, things could have gone in a
Oh,
completely different direction. And I'm so grateful for that because
mhm.
I needed that. And it could be like as I'm reflecting while I'm speaking here, there are one or two moments, and that may not seem like a lot, but they were instrumental. And I remember recognizing that and having this emotional experience last year around that, that, hey, if this man hadn't stepped in at this point, I wouldn't be where I am today. And that's huge because he had a role to play in that. And now I can pay it forward in many different ways.
Yeah, and I think what you said was perfect. 1 to 2, maybe 3 moments. In a completely dark room, you only need a single light to give
Mm,
direction, right? Like, we can't forget how important a single moment of learning or a gift like that can set course to our direction. The great, what we talk about is our northern light
yeah.
through biblical or through everything else. That single moment, that single event was that which guided them for the rest of their lives. Like, each and every one of these moments, yeah, are it's the ripple in the pond.
Yeah.
No one could say how important those truly are, but they really are. And I think that very similar for myself. I have very distinct moments where I would say my character and who I am is greatly affected by a number of things. Very few, but the importance of them cannot be measured that my dad bestowed upon me through his grace, and how grateful I am for that.
And that's what makes them the superheroes of our life, right?
It truly does.
Yes.
And assholes. No.
Yeah, that's the story of I often reflect on that. Like you always see in the superhero movie where they are struggling and beating themselves up and really not choosing that path for themselves. And you're just the entire movie, you're like, come on, turn it around. And they do because
Yeah.
it's a movie, but that's not real life.
No.
So how
No.
can you and I think part of the reason why we cheer for that individual is because we can all see ourselves in that person. And I think we see
Yeah.
ourselves in our dads. And part of our fear is at times, I hope I don't end up this way, but we're going to have
Well,
our own struggles in different ways. Where I like to always remind myself and people when they're grateful for me, at least having that gift of being able to see them. I always say, we're all in this together.
we're a community.
Yeah.
And no matter what's being touted out there, have a bigger backyard, have more space, have someone deliver your groceries. The idea that we're social creatures that don't have the ability to do it all on our own, and to give ourselves the forgiveness to do that as a community, to be there for each other in our lowest points, in our most misguided points, in our treasured points, and to celebrate those wins and to lift each other up in our failures. That's the true end goal in my mind. And we only do that with community, with family. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. Kirk, as always, a pleasure. Thank you for doing this. I'm sure, like timing wise, I wanted to get this out for Father's Day because I think at the end of the day, I tend not to buy into these specific times where we get to remember our parents, but it is always meaningful. It's just an extra reminder of the role that they have played in our lives. And I think
mhm.
we both agree that we can think of those and how can we remind ourselves of those moments because we are where we are today for those small gestures, which may seem small to them, but have been huge for us, and how can we continue to
Yeah,
remind
no,
us? Yeah.
absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity, and always a pleasure, Ferk.
All right. I'll let you get on. Maybe you can debrief your kids on what you were talking about, but
Dinner talk. Here we go. Uh,
yeah, exactly. Thanks, Kirk. Appreciate it. And if there's anything else you want to add, I'll leave that up to you. If not, we'll call it for now and until next time.
yeah, I think just keep doing what you're doing, buddy. I love it, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.